and that all the people that went to Canada just ran away. I was prepared to go to prison and fight my case for as long as the war lasted. Going to Canada was the hardest. It was questions of manhood, giving up your family, your country, your friends, giving up everything you knew. I went to Canada with the assumption I would be there for the rest of my life, that I would be an exile, a criminal, wanted by the FBI, and that I could never come home again. So when I was here at Sonoma State and in high school, these were the kinds of decisions that were being made by essentially my peers, by young people of my age or a little older. And I just find it moving to think about that process that people go through to make decisions that are momentous for themselves, but also have an impact on the rest of the culture and the society and the war. Ron's going to talk a little bit more about that. But thank you so much, and special thanks to my old professor, Les Adler, who was so encouraging to me when I was here at Sonoma State. Thanks for being here.
I just want to point out the three people that Barbara talked about. Donald Duncan is on the cover of the Ramparts magazine there. The sergeant, the headline says, "I quit." And in the book, it has an expanded version of his writing about that. Greg Payton is there in the second panel down, a large black man, and he's standing next to three photographs that I retrieved from the National Archives. One shows the stockade or prison at Long Binh, Vietnam, before and then below it after the inmates burned it down. It was called the Long Binh Stockade, but the soldiers renamed it Long Binh Jail so they could have the initials LBJ for President Johnson. And then just below to the right there, next to the burned down stockade, he tells in his essay, in his book, that after he left the high security part of the prison and went to low security, the fellows in high security asked him to smuggle in a little bit of kerosene every day that they would preserve to burn it down. But before they burned it down, the essay says, they broke the locks to let the people out of the individual prisons. Of course, killed. So I'm going through the files of the investigation about the burning of that prison at the U.S. National Archives, 5 miles from our house. And lo and behold, I come across this photograph of 5 broken locks as an official part of the investigation. So there are 3 people. Oh, Mike Wong. Mike Wong's picture is the last panel down here. This exhibit opened in Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, at the War Remnants Museum, March 19th, 2 years ago. And Mike Wong and 30 other Vietnam veterans came to the opening on the first day, the 19th. And then on the second day, we had a dialogue with an equal number of Vietnamese veterans, both men and women, men who were warriors and women who were part of the underground in Saigon. And it was very powerful. And folks there would ask Mike Wong and others to stand next to his photograph from before. Very, very moving experience. Barbara's presentation was about the turning point for individuals. But this exhibit is more than that. It's not a criticism, it's a combination. This exhibit is, I find it a very inspiring story because it's how those individuals then began to build a movement. So it's more than a sum of individual And how was this movement built, one might ask? And I would say much the same way people today are building movements, whether it's against misogyny or for reproductive rights or against widespread availability of guns or to combat climate change. It's a combination of talking with people individually, recruiting people, understanding where they come from, and then through some means of social media, spreading the word with the social media, creating protests, bringing people together finally so they can feel that strength in numbers. The GI movement did much the same without computers, without iPhones, and their social media was the underground press. And so the first two panels beyond the introductory panel you see behind you, we have the front covers of different newspapers. How many newspapers? Close to 300 during that war, produced at various military installations throughout the United States, but also Germany, the Philippines, Japan, Okinawa. So I like to say to people that the GI press was the social media today, telling their stories in almost real time. Perhaps it took a month or two for publication and distribution. I say 300 papers, but at any individual base, they would perhaps print up 1 or 2 or 3,000 copies. And then after we got them back from the printer, distribute them during the night clandestinely because you could be court-martialed, sent to jail or distributed. You had the right, in theory, to own any one piece of literature, but it was illegal to distribute it. And in fact, we have in that panel right there, 1, 2, the third one down, we have a fellow, Cherry Urban, with 2 papers. One is the paper that they produced at Fort Lewis in Tacoma, Washington. And the other one, and he was arrested and convicted of distributing that underground paper. In his other hand is the Declaration of Independence. And he thought, I know what I'll do. On July 4th, I'll distribute copies of the Declaration of Independence. And sure enough, he was busted for that. It was tough building a movement in the military during the time of war, but they persisted. One of Barbara's contributions was helping to organize this story thematically, both on the exhibit panels and within the book, and coming up with catchy titles. So the title for chapter 3, and that's those couple of panels over there, was
Resistance HQ.
There you go. Even today, she does it better than me. Resistance HQ, meaning the coffee houses. We set up coffee houses just outside of the gates of, by 1971, 32 different locations within the United States. And this would give soldiers, when they were off work or on the weekend and had some time off, a place to go, talk to each other, listen to rock and roll, have some coffee in a non-exploitative setting. Not a bar, not a place filled with prostitutes, not jewelry stores where the salespeople were standing outside saying, "Hey, GI, get this for your mom, get this for your girlfriend, give me your money." And that's what army towns were typically like. In those coffee houses, soldiers would, particularly those back from Vietnam, would write their stories. And they were filled, as Greg Payton was, with rage. In fact, on that panel there, next to those containers, you see a white GI with a white t-shirt holding multiple copies of his paper. This is a GI who was a Marine stationed in Vietnam. And I must say, contrary to what a lot of the popular belief is, I'm quite sure that the majority of soldiers who have ended up opposing the war in reality were people who enlisted. They were not drafted against their will. They enlisted because they thought it was a patriotic thing to do. Their families had served many generations in the military. They were 17 or 18 and naive politically, and the president asked us to do something. I think we should do it. That picture is Paul Cox. He lives in Oakland. He's the head of the building committee for the Veterans Building in San Francisco, where this exhibit will be going next. It'll open up there on the 17th of March. And he was a witness to what he calls his own mini My Lai, where his company went in and slaughtered, not like the My Lai massacre, 504 civilian women and children and babies, a mere 15 innocent non-combatants. He witnessed that, and he was horrified, and no one would do anything about it. No one in the command cared. In fact, they encouraged that because the officers were going to Congress, wanted to be able to talk about how many people were killed, and they pretended that they were combatants. And so what the military was looking for was high body count. Well, you can imagine that if you volunteer to do the right thing and you find out you're doing the wrong thing, the emotional passion, and that's why when he came back to Camp Lejeune in the Carolinas after serving in Vietnam, he still had 18 months left to go before his tour was over. He began to produce an underground paper that he labeled Rage. That was the name of his paper. At these coffee houses, they also organized marches, protests. They would talk about in the papers what was going on in their particular base, the mistreatment there, funny stories. In one of the papers, we have the entire 16 pages in the appendix here, the paper out of Fort McClellan, Alabama, a paper called Left Face, where there's a John Lennon interview. I mean, all kinds of culture. There's interviews with people just back from Vietnam. And they would, when folks at One Army base had some kind of significant protest, then they would write about it. There was something even called the GI Press Service, where they would share their papers among them and doing it that way. I want to tell just two other stories quickly. I saw Greg Payton for the first time 3 weeks ago when we had this exhibit at Duke University. I had read his story here, I've seen his picture, I was curious. I had a great time with him, I had dinner with him. As with others, it's amazing how even 45 and 50 years later, people are unable to shake that sense of moral injury. And I'd like to encourage people to use the term moral injury. Everyone has heard about PTSD, people reacting to loud noises, a backfire in a car, as if that's a memory of mortar shells or bullets whizzing by. But only in the past few years have people begun to talk about moral injury, and that's different. That's moral injury comes from participating in an unjust war, whether you initially went over in favor and then turned against it, or you were reluctantly there, and it haunts people forever. I also met there Dave Doherty at Duke University, who worked with me at a coffee house in Anniston, Alabama, outside of Fort McClellan, which was the advanced training for chemical warfare. Chemical warfare being Agent Orange, Agent Blue, Agent White, napalm. And in one of the last panels, there's some pictures I took in Vietnam 3 years ago when I first went over there, my first time, of a woman who's 36-year-old, second generation. Her father was a soldier for the North Vietnamese Army, was sprayed with Agent Orange. He survived, but this goes through changes in genetic composition. 36-year-old woman, never walked, never talked. I'm invited to go and meet her mother. She brings me and she says, "Do you want to come and meet my daughter?" And go into the house. The mother hops up on the bed, you can see it there, lays her right hand on her daughter's thigh to show warmth and compassion. And I took that photograph, and I am moved by that to this day myself. Dave Doherty, who I was mentioning, worked with me at Coffee House in Anniston, Alabama, is from Canada. His father was in the Canadian Army, but during the war, he came down to the U.S. at age 17 and volunteered because he wanted to go to Vietnam and fight for the United States. He served one tour and re-upped for a second tour. And during that second tour, he was the crew chief of a helicopter gunship. He and his crew realized that they had just wiped out an entire village of non-combatants. And they were deeply, deeply disturbed and came back and told their officers, "We will not go back and do that again. We will not fly any more missions unless you can give us assurances we're not going to be killing non-combatants." And his officers would not give him that assurance. And they did not continue fighting. And there's many other stories, and the book is full of stories of other people who suffered like this. He ended up coming back to the United States in handcuffs. Never told his parents that. Again, a lot of people were more worried about what their family's going to say than anything else. And it's interesting because I worked with him for almost a year in Anniston, Alabama, 1970, 71. He had never told me this story before 3 weeks ago. I never knew how he ended up joining the GI movement and became a regular staff member of our coffee house group. Last thing I want to talk about is fragging. And I don't have anything in this exhibit about fragging, but we do in the book. Fragging is when our own troops take a fragmentation hand grenade and throw it into the tent where their officers are sleeping. And why would they do that? They did that because they were there for 12-month, 13-month tours. The Pentagon wanted to rotate second lieutenants through on 6-month tours because they wanted to give enough graduates from West Point the opportunity to go and fight and get medals. And these second lieutenants were often super gung-ho. They didn't care what happened to their troops. They didn't care if the assignment was nuts. They didn't care if the hill that they were ordering the soldiers to take away from the North Vietnamese Army or the Viet Cong had been taken 3 times before in the past year, only to have them abandon it and then send them up again. Crazy stuff. And the soldiers finally were fed up with that. It didn't make sense. The whole war didn't make sense. But you're sending us out there again to kill and be killed, often totally slaughtered. And the most significant piece, I think, of this exhibit is that Daily News. In 1969, the Daily News was the largest circulation paper in the United States out of New York. Sir, my men refused to go. About a whole company that refused to go on one of these missions. And one of the ways that the soldiers could fight back against their own officers was by fragging. They didn't do it lightly. Often what they would do is take a hand grenade and leave it on the bunk, completely intact as a warning. If that didn't work, sometimes they would, a short time later, toss a smoke grenade in. And only if that didn't work would they sometimes toss in a live grenade. I didn't include this in the initial exhibit because it had to be approved by the Hanoi Vietnamese authorities. I didn't know if it would be too anti-establishment for them and if maybe they'd say no to the whole exhibit. But when it came time that Barbara and I were working on the book, I'm thinking, how can you not include fragging as part of the story of GI resistance? There were, as the book explains over 800 incidents of people being killed by fragging. But more than that, the essay points out, the essay is by our third co-editor, David Courtwright, who's foremost expert in the GI anti-war movement, were the hundreds and hundreds of thousands more where there were the warnings, or others who just crazy second lieutenants backed off for fear that they would become. So this is significant. How significant? This is so significant that December 13th, 1969, the U.S. Marine Commandant issued a directive requiring Marines coming back to their base camp to turn in their weapons during wartime to a storage unit, their rifles and their hand grenades. And that directive refers, and we have a quote here, especially heinous and despicable in the form of assault and attempted murder, known colloquially as fragging. And 6 months later, the Army issued a similar directive. So think about that, a Marine directive in 1969 ordering people to give up their weapons in the war zone at their base camp. And if that's not significant enough, I want to end by passing on this little note that a few days ago, I saw an article that said that last week, the Marines issued another order. And you heard the story of racism in the Army. Well, this order, I mean, one of the things that we didn't mention about racism is that a lot of the officers were from the South. A lot of them displayed giant Confederate flags. I mean, imagine what it's like to be a black GI and be confronted with that, as well as racial insults. So just last week, the Marines issued an order prohibiting the display of Confederate flags. 50 years after their order to take action to stop fragging. It took them 50 additional years to decide that Confederate flags and other symbols were inappropriate. To me, that speaks volumes. And I want to leave it there. And thank you very much.
Questions?
Yes, questions. And then at some point, we're supposed to get copies of this book to sell. We have postcards we can give you where you can order them online, and we could even take orders. Questions for either of us, or for Greg, or for Mark Wong. Unfortunately, Donald Duncan's not with us anymore, so he can't answer questions. So we have veterans of the war here who are going to speak right after this. Any questions? Yes.
It's not a question, but it's sort of a simultaneous work going on by Jeff Patterson.
Yes.
Do you know him?
Yes.
Okay. That he is doing an interview, the same as you've got the chapters about various veterans in the book. And he has a whole series of live interviews with veterans, and I believe they're all available on the VFP National website. I know they're available other places, but
Yes. We have some of them on our own website, wagingpeaceinvietnam.com or .org. Other thoughts or questions? Yes. Good question. Did people hear that? What kind of resistance do you see today to these endless wars? Well, the next panel will be talking about that to some extent, but I can say that this exhibit, or a similar exhibit, has remained in Vietnam. This is a copy that we made to tour U.S. campuses. And when we did that, knowing that there are a lot of veterans at all of our schools these days, we added a panel that's in that far corner with 3 veterans of the Iraq War who were all came back and began resisting and building an organization initially called Iraq Veterans Against the War. It's now called About Face. Good name. And you can read their stories, and there's also a picture of their first big conference on that. So it is not as robust, unfortunately. On the other hand, the Pew Polling Company released a poll that I read about in Army Times last July that said over 50%, in one area it was 60-something, another area was 80%, of the veterans of these recent wars believe that they were not worthwhile. Now, that is a huge number. I mean, if you compare that to people who served in Korea or World War II, you would find nothing like that, as horrendous as an experience as that might have been for them. But for significantly more than 50% to say that it was not worthwhile. You know, what do we have to do to convince our leaders today to pause before they send young people to war? I mean, people talk about the 80,000, I mean, the 58,000 whose names are listed on the wall in Washington who were killed. But how about the hundreds of thousands more who were maimed and mutilated? How about the hundreds of thousands more who came back addicted and with ruined lives? How about their families who were so disturbed? How about this as a figure? In the last decade, more than 60,000 veterans of the Vietnam War committed suicide, only in one decade. More than were killed during the war enlisted on the wall. The human devastation of these wars is so much greater than we easily recognize. I mean, there should be a book just on that. It's a terrible situation. Other comments? Okay, let's do just one more then.
You see that still showing up. Please, still a strong reaction.
I am so heartened by the movement of young people today, the Parkland movement, feminist movement, the climate action movement. I'm overwhelmingly optimistic. We made this exhibit to be an inspiration to people, because if you can create a movement in the midst of the Army during a time of war, under military law with really severe consequences. I mean, some people ended up in 3 years, some people ended up with 16-year prison sentences, but they still built a movement, and most people did not serve that long in jail. Howard Zinn, the historian, was a mentor to me, and he remained his whole life very enthusiastic, and maybe some of that, very optimistic, maybe some of that rubbed off on me. But I'm very hopeful. Thank you very much.
One part of the next presentation where we're supposed to be showing a video, and I've got it on a thumb drive.